At 10:30 p.m. on October 24, 1942, Sergeant Mitchell Page crouched in a foxhole on the blackened ridge of Guadalcanal, running his hand over the cold steel breech of a weapon that half the United States Marine Corps considered a joke. Before start this video, please subscribe our channel for more historical videos. It was raining, the kind of heavy tropical sheets of water that turned the jungle floor into a slurry of mud and rotting vegetation. 200 yards to the south, the jungle was alive. The snapping of twigs, the clinking of metal on wood, the whispered commands of thousands of men moving into position. The Japanese 2nd Division, the feared Sendai, was out there in the dark. They were the finest jungle fighters in the Emperor's army, undefeated, battle-hardened, and thirsty for American blood. They had marched through hundreds of miles of hell to reach this ridge, and their orders were simple: break the Marine line, seize the airfield, push the Americans into the sea. Page looked at the weapons sitting in the mud next to his machine guns. It was the 37mm M3 anti-tank gun. To a civilian, it might have looked like a cannon. To a soldier, it looked like a toy. The barrel was absurdly thin, barely wider than a drain pipe. The wheels were small and spindly, looking more like they belonged on a farm cart than a weapon of war. It sat low to the ground, unassuming, unimpressive, and, according to the experts, completely useless. The men in the rifle companies called it the pea shooter. They called it the door knocker. They made bets on whether a round from this gun could even penetrate a sheet of plywood, let alone the armor of a tank. On a battlefield dominated by heavy artillery and massive naval guns, the little M3 was a punchline. But on this night, in the driving rain, Mitchell Page did not treat it like a joke. He treated it like the only thing standing between his men and a massacre. The reputation of the 37mm gun had died long before it ever reached the jungle. In the deserts of North Africa and the fields of Europe, the war had evolved faster than the engineers could keep up. German tanks had grown thicker skin. Their steel armor plates had become impenetrable walls that shrugged off light-caliber shells like rain off a windshield. When American crews fired the 37mm at German panzers, the shells simply bounced off. They would hit with a spark and ricochet into the sky, leaving nothing but a scratch on the paint and a very angry German tank crew. The reports coming back to Washington were brutal. The gun was obsolete. It was underpowered. It was a waste of steel and shipping space. The High Command had already begun phasing it out, replacing it with bigger, heavier guns that could actually punch a hole in enemy armor. But the Marine Corps does not throw things away. When the 1st Marine Division packed their transport ships for the invasion of the Solomon Islands, they took every weapon they could get their hands on, including the despised M3. The gun crews knew what the rest of the infantry thought of them. They heard the snickering when they unloaded the crates on the beach. They saw the looks of pity when they dragged the 900-pound guns through the soft sand. It was an embarrassing weapon to be assigned to. It felt like being handed a slingshot to fight a bear. The infantry guys carried rifles that worked. The mortar teams dropped explosives that could level a house. The 37mm crews were dragging around a piece of junk that couldn't kill a tank and was too clumsy to kill a soldier. Or so they thought. The misery of the gun crews was compounded by the island itself. Guadalcanal was not just a battlefield, it was a biological weapon. The heat sat on the island like a wet wool blanket, suffocating anyone who tried to move. The mud was alive, a suction cup that grabbed boots and wheels and refused to let go. Moving a rifleman was hard. Moving a 900-pound cannon was torture. The gun crews became pack mules. They strapped harnesses to their chests and dragged the guns through swamps that came up to their waists. They hauled them up ridgelines that were so steep they had to dig their fingernails into the dirt to keep from sliding back down. And every step of the way, the infantry mocked them. They asked why they were bothering. They asked if they planned to hunt squirrels with that thing. They asked why they didn't just leave the dead weight on the beach and carry extra ammunition for the real guns. The mockery wasn't just mean-spirited. It was logical. The terrain of Guadalcanal was dense, tangled rainforest. Visibility was often less than 20 feet. Trees grew so close together that a man had to turn his shoulders sideways to squeeze through. It was infantry country. It was knife and grenade country. It was no place for a cannon. You couldn't tow a gun through the vines. You couldn't find a line of sight to fire it. And even if you could, there were no Japanese tanks to shoot at. The Japanese armor was stuck on the other side of the river, bogged down in the same mud that was killing the Marines. So the experts looked at the 37mm guns sitting on the ridge and shook their heads. It was a textbook example of military stupidity, bringing the wrong weapon to the wrong fight. But the experts had missed something. They were thinking about the 37mm as an anti-tank gun. They were thinking about armor penetration tables and muzzle velocity and kinetic energy. They were thinking about math. Sergeant Page and the gun crews were not thinking about math. They were thinking about survival. They knew that the Japanese tactic was not to sit back and duel with artillery. The Japanese tactic was the bonsai, the human wave. They would gather thousands of men, fix bayonets, and sprint directly into the American machine guns. They didn't care about casualties. They didn't care about tactics. They cared about overwhelming the line with sheer biological mass. It was a terrifying, suicidal strategy that had broken Allied lines across the Pacific. Against a human wave, a rifle is too slow. A machine gun is good, but machine guns overheat. Belts melt, and when the enemy is 10 feet away and screaming, you don't need precision. You need violence. You need something that can stop a dozen men in a heartbeat. The gun crews looked at their useless little cannon and wondered if it could be repurposed. They wondered if the weapon that was too weak to kill a tank might be too strong for anything else. They looked at the crates of ammunition stacked in the mud. There were the standard armor-piercing rounds, the solid steel slugs designed to punch through metal. Those were useless here. But buried in the manifest at the bottom of the stack was a different kind of shell. A shell that the manual said was for clearing brush and barbed wire, a shell that nobody ever used. The sun went down on October 24th, and the jungle turned pitch black. The Marines on the line were exhausted. They had been fighting for weeks. They were riddled with malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot. They were starving, surviving on captured Japanese rice and wormy chocolate. Their uniforms were rotting off their bodies. They were outnumbered 10-1. Across the lines, the Sendai Division was fresh. They had landed recently, bringing heavy mortars and fresh troops. They had studied the Marine positions. They knew exactly where the weak points were. They knew that the line defending Henderson Field was thin, stretched to the breaking point. They knew that if they punched hard enough, the Americans would break. General Maruyama, the Japanese commander, had written the date in his diary. This was the night the Americans would die. This was the night the Emperor's flag would fly over the airfield. He didn't care about the Marine machine guns. He had enough men to absorb the bullets. He certainly didn't care about the toy cannons the Americans had dragged up the hill. His intelligence officers had told him about the 37mm guns. They had laughed about them, too. They told the general that the Americans were so desperate they were using training weapons. They believed the little guns would be overrun in the first 30 seconds of the charge. They believed the crews would abandon them and run. Back in the foxhole, Sergeant Page wiped the rain from his eyes. He checked the action on his machine gun, then he looked over at the 37mm gun crew. They were soaked to the bone, shivering in the darkness. They had stripped the heavy steel shield off the front of the gun to save weight, leaving themselves completely exposed. If a Japanese soldier fired a rifle from the tree line, there was nothing to stop the bullet. If a mortar landed nearby, there was no steel to catch the fragments. The crews were trading their safety for speed. Without the heavy shield, the gun was balanced perfectly on its wheels. A single man could grab the trail and swing the barrel left or right as fast as he could turn his body. They had turned a stationary artillery piece into a giant pistol that they could aim by hand. They stacked the canister rounds in the mud next to the wheels. They cleaned the mud off the breech blocks. They checked the recoil springs. And then they waited. The rain kept falling. The water filled the bottom of the foxholes, soaking their boots and rotting their socks. The waiting was always the worst part. Your mind starts to play tricks on you in the dark. A swaying branch looks like a soldier. A gust of wind sounds like a whisper. The men gripped the cold steel of the gun trails, their knuckles white. They knew what was out there. The Sendai Division wasn't just a mob of conscripts. They were veterans who had raped and pillaged their way across Asia. They didn't surrender. They didn't retreat, and they were coming for the airfield. At 11 o'clock, the first probe hit. It wasn't the main attack, it was a testing jab, a few squads of Japanese infantry moving silently up the slope to find the Marine machine guns. They wanted the Americans to open fire, to reveal their positions so the Japanese mortars could destroy them. A machine gunner on the left flank saw movement and squeezed his trigger. The tracers zipped into the dark, illuminating the rain.
The Japanese answered instantly. Rifles cracked from the jungle floor. A Nambu light machine gun opened up from a tree stump. The ridgeline erupted into a chaotic exchange of green and red tracers. A group of Japanese soldiers broke cover, sprinting towards the line. They were screaming, bayonets fixed, moving fast across the slippery ground. They thought they had found the weak point. They thought they were safe. They were wrong. The gunner on the number 1 37mm gun didn't use a sight. He didn't look through a scope. He just looked over the open barrel, grabbed the traverse wheel, and swung the naked gun towards the running shapes. He shouted the command. The loader slammed a canister round into the breech. The block slid home with a heavy metallic clack. The gunner stomped on the firing pedal. The sound was not the sharp crack of a rifle or the rhythmic thump of a machine gun. It was a roar, a sudden concussive blast that shook the water off the nearby leaves. A 3-foot tongue of flame erupted from the barrel, and then the physics took over. The canister shell disintegrated. The
37mm guns opened up in unison. The pea shooters began to bark. Boom, clack, boom, clack. The crews worked with a frantic, robotic rhythm. Load, fire, eject. Load, fire, eject. Each shot sent a swarm of steel balls into the mass of attackers. The canister rounds cut massive lanes through the Japanese formation. It was like watching a scythe cut through wheat. Wherever the guns pointed, the charge collapsed. Men were thrown backward, lifted off their feet by the impact of multiple steel balls. But the Japanese kept coming. There were too many of them. For every 10 men the canister shot killed, 20 more appeared from the dark. They began to focus their fire on the exposed gun crews. Bullets pinged off the wheels and the barrels. A loader on the number 2 gun took a round in the shoulder and collapsed into the mud. Another man jumped from a nearby foxhole to take his place, slipping on the wet brass casings that were piling up around the wheels. The suicide modification of stripping the shields was now exacting its price. The crews were bleeding. They were taking shrapnel from grenades that landed too close, but they couldn't stop. The barrel of the number 1 gun began to smoke. The paint on the steel was bubbling from the heat. The recoil system was working so hard that the gun was digging itself deeper into the mud with every shot. The gunner was screaming, his ears ringing so loud he couldn't hear the orders. He just watched the tracers and the shapes in the dark. He saw a Japanese officer with a sword leading a group of men toward the right flank, trying to get around the cone of fire. The gunner slammed his shoulder into the traverse bar, swinging the hot barrel right. He didn't wait for the loader to tap his helmet. He stomped the pedal. The gun roared. The officer and his men disappeared in a spray of mud and steel. The supply of canister shells was dropping fast. The pile of fresh rounds was shrinking, while the pile of empty brass grew into a mound that the crew was slipping on. The gun sergeant looked at the crate. He saw the bottom. They were burning through ammo at a rate that wasn't sustainable. And the Japanese were still coming. The screaming hadn't stopped. The horn was still blowing. The enemy was closing the distance inch by bloody inch. The pea shooters had held the first wave, but the ocean was vast and the tide was rising. By 2 a.m., the battle had stopped being a military engagement and had turned into a bar fight in a graveyard. The orderly lines on the map were gone. The clear fields of fire were gone. The Japanese Sendai Division had pushed so close that the Marines could smell them. The air was thick with the copper stench of blood and the sulfur reek of gunpowder. The jungle ridge, which had been pitch black 3 hours ago, was now lit by a flickering strobe light of muzzle flashes and flares. And right in the center of that chaos, the 37mm guns were screaming. The pea shooters were now operating in a world they were never designed for. The manual said the maximum rate of fire was 25 rounds per minute. The crews were firing 30, maybe 35. They were loading and firing so fast that the recoil mechanisms didn't have time to reset. The guns were literally bouncing off the ground with every shot, the wheels slamming into the mud, splashing dirty water onto the red-hot barrels. The water sizzled and turned to steam instantly, wrapping the gun crews in a fog that smelled like boiling oil. The hydraulic fluid inside the recoil cylinders was so hot it was starting to expand, making the guns kick like angry mules. The gunners weren't aiming anymore. There was no point. The targets weren't individual soldiers. The target was the darkness itself. The Japanese were pouring out of the jungle like ants from a kicked hill.
They came in clusters of 10, 20, 50 men. They threw themselves at the guns, screaming, firing from the hip, throwing grenades. The gun crews responded with the only thing they had left, raw speed. The loader would jam a canister shell in, the gunner would stomp the pedal, and a cone of steel would erase everything in front of the muzzle. It was industrial slaughter. At 50 yards, the canister shot didn't just kill, it disassembled. It tore through the dense vegetation, shredding the vines and the trees, until the jungle in front of the guns looked like it had been cleared by a bulldozer. But the guns were dying. The heat was the enemy now. The steel barrels were glowing a dull cherry red in the night. The heat was so intense that if a loader's skin touched the metal, it would sear the flesh instantly. The grease on the breech blocks had cooked off hours ago, leaving dry metal grinding against dry metal. The crews had to kick the breech handles open with their boots because they were too hot to touch with gloves. They were pouring canteen water over the barrels to cool them down, but the water evaporated before it could do any good. They were running the guns into the ground, pushing the machinery past the breaking point, because if the gun stopped, the line broke, and if the line broke, everybody died. Then the inevitable happened. The Japanese found the gap. A suicide squad of grenadiers managed to crawl through the drainage ditch on the left flank, slipping under the cones of machine gun fire. They popped up 20 yards from the number 2 gun. The crew never saw them. 3 grenades landed in the mud pit around the wheels. The explosion silenced the gun instantly. The crew was gone. The gun itself was knocked off its axis, one wheel shattered, the barrel pointing uselessly at the sky. The line began to buckle. With one gun down, the volume of fire dropped by half. The Japanese sensed it immediately. They surged toward the gap where the number 2 gun had been. They were screaming so loud it drowned out the roar of the engines from the airfield below. They were coming through the wire. They were inside the perimeter. This was the moment battles are lost. This was the moment when panic usually sets in, when men look at the overwhelming odds and decide to run. Sergeant Mitchell Page did not run. He watched the number 2 gun go down and something inside him snapped. He wasn't just a sergeant anymore. He was a force of nature. He grabbed his machine gun and ran. He didn't run away from the breach. He ran directly into it. He sprinted through the mud, dodging bullets, jumping over dead bodies, heading for the silenced gun position. He reached the crater where his men had died. The gun was useless, but the position was critical. If the Japanese took this hole, they could roll up the entire Marine line from the side. Page realized he couldn't fix the 37mm gun, but he could fill the silence it left behind. He set up his machine gun on the edge of the foxhole. He was alone, no loader, no spotter, just a man and 30 pounds of steel. He opened fire. The Japanese were 10 yards away, swarming over the sandbags. He cut them down. He swung the gun left and right, sweeping the area, screaming insults into the dark. He was buying time. He was plugging the dam with his own body. Back at the remaining 37mm guns, the situation was desperate. They were down to the last few crates of canister. The loaders were scraping the bottom of the boxes, pulling out shells that were covered in mud and grime. They wiped them on their shirts and shoved them into the breeches. The guns were so hot that the rounds were in danger of cooking off, exploding simply from the heat of the chamber before the trigger was pulled. The gunners had to time it perfectly. Load, fire, immediately. Do not let the shells sit in the chamber for a second. The Japanese changed tactics. They stopped charging the machine guns and focused everything on the last functional 37mm gun. They knew it was the anchor. They could see the massive muzzle flash illuminating the ridge every 2 seconds. It was a beacon. Mortar rounds started walking toward the position. Thump, crash, thump, crash. The explosions walked closer, throwing dirt and shrapnel over the crew. The shield was gone. Remember, they had stripped it off. There was nothing between the crew and the shrapnel but their own luck. A mortar round landed 5 yards in front of the wheel. The concussion lifted the 900-pound gun off the ground. The gunner was thrown backward, blood streaming from his ears. He shook his head, crawled back to the seat, and put his eye back on the target. He didn't check for wounds. He checked the gun. It was still working. He stomped the pedal. Boom! Another cone of steel flew into the dark. The crew was operating on pure instinct now. They were zombies, moving only because their muscle memory told them to. They were deaf, blind, and bleeding, but they kept the rhythm. Load, fire, Load. Fire. Then the worst sound in the world. Click. The loader reached into the crate and his hand hit wood. Empty. He checked the next crate. Empty. He looked around the mud pit frantically. There were thousands of empty brass casings littering the ground, shining in the flare light like gold coins, but no live rounds. The pea shooter had eaten everything. The gunner looked at the loader. The loader shook his head. The gun fell silent. The silence was louder than the noise. The Japanese heard it instantly. The rhythmic roar of the cannon was gone. They knew what it meant. They surged forward, a tidal wave of brown uniforms rising from the grass. This was the final push. They were going to overrun the position. They were going to kill everyone. But Mitchell Page wasn't done. He watched the number 2 gun go down, and something inside him snapped. He wasn't just a sergeant anymore. He was a force of nature. He grabbed his machine gun and ran. He didn't run away from the breach. He ran directly into it. He sprinted through the mud, dodging bullets, jumping over dead bodies, heading for the silenced gun position. He reached the crater where his men had died. The gun was useless, but the position was critical. If the Japanese took this hole, they could roll up the entire Marine line from the side. Page realized he couldn't fix the 37mm gun, but he could fill the silence it left behind. He set up his machine gun on the edge of the foxhole. He was alone. No loader, no spotter. Just a man and 30 pounds of steel. He opened fire. The Japanese were 10 yards away, swarming over the sandbags. He cut them down. He swung the gun left and right, sweeping the area, screaming insults into the dark. He was buying time. He was plugging the dam with his own body. Back at the remaining 37mm guns, the situation was desperate. They were down to the last few crates of canister. The loaders were scraping the bottom of the